again for speaking with me. That
Absolutely.
faith it's one of the most haunting documentaries I have seen this year. And what I wanted to know is white Christian nationalism, as shown in the documentary, has been around for a long time. It's really started its gaining popularity in the 80s. Why do you feel right now it's the most important time to bring this to light?
Well, I feel like religion has been used as a means to disorient uh, or to, I guess, it's been used as a political tool since the founding of the nation, essentially. And I think, as you mentioned, it's only been really since the early 80s that it has been utilized so efficiently and so effectively to to hone in and sort of weaponize particular minorities within the Christian community. Um, and I think, unfortunately, just the effectiveness of this movement over the last few decades, they've managed to bring more and more people into the fold. And I think, I mean, I know with respect to the Republican Party, um, I know not everyone identifies as a Christian necessarily, but I feel like with a lot of the MAGA wing of the America First sort of wing of the Republican Party, it's almost like a litmus test where they're like, wait, are you or are you not a Christian? And if you are you or are you not our interpretation of what Christianity is? And I guess what's disturbing about that is I'm I'm it's not up to us to determine whether someone's statements are an authentic extension of their beliefs or if they're in fact just using it using faith as a tool. So there's no way that's between them and their God. But I guess it's this sort of there's this sort of very I guess what's the term? There's this very universal, very ultimate sort of take on what entails like what a good Christian is, what a bad Christian is. Like you have these political figures making these statements about the character and the beliefs and fundamental values of individuals, rather than focusing on a broader movement. And I guess as far as MAGA is concerned, they're kind of pulling from wherever they can get interest, right? Because I feel like they do constitute a minority perspective. Um, so yeah, they use fear and this fear of an ultimate power of like, oh, the evil Democrats who are in cahoots with the devil or whatever. They're kind of like, well, if we can't appeal to you um, on an intellectual level, then we can definitely find a way to appeal to you on an emotional level. Um, so I think it's yeah, there's just sort of this stew of uh, misinformation, conspiratorial thinking, a lot of groups that would have been perceived as like fringe, um, who are now sort of in close proximity to the former president. I mean, I always cite, the meeting of Kanye West and Nick Fuentes with Trump at Mar-a-Lago. You're like, whoa, like this guy is a serious contender for the presidency, and he's hanging out with an open, like white supremacist, and it refers to himself as a neo-Nazi. You're like, okay, that's pretty wild. Like that's definitely unprecedented. And yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter what Trump does. He still has so much popular support. We're kind of like, okay, what can we do to kind of, I guess, get people who are divided or uncertain about the choices that are in front of them to think more about, even if they're not enthusiastic about someone like Joe Biden, sort of like, at the very least, you have one individual who upholds the value of our democratic institutions, and you have another individual who is embracing more authoritarian, like autocratic tendencies that are antithetical to our values as a democratic republic. So I feel like I I think my generation and Gen Z, I think they're I know a lot of the talk on TikTok is people are talking about like, oh, let's think about third party candidates as a way to like get things to shift a little bit. But this isn't something that's going to happen in one election cycle, like the kind of change I think people are yearning for. So it's going to take a little bit more time than the next few months leading up to the election for that real change to happen. So yeah, I'm hoping people can think of it in those terms, which I don't know. I don't like to be black and white about things at all, but I mean that's the reality. We have a two-party system, and these are the two options. I'm like, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, wish I had something more insightful to say about that, but.
No, it was good. But what's really interesting, the documentary makes it important in terms of Trump is a symptom and not the cause. So no matter who gets elected within that party, there will always be someone to replace him. And with that, I wanted to talk about, you bring up Paul Wright, Calvinism, and Rushdie.
Oh, Rushdoony?
Yes,
Rousas
correct.
Rushdoony? Yeah.
Yes. So what about it? There are different tactics that is used because they originally was trying to go through segregation, and that's how they would get people to come in, and they realized that wasn't really popular. So instead, using the tactic of abortion because that's more universal. Look at the family and the destruction of the family. Can you talk about the importance of bringing in both the Calvinism, the Rushdoony, and the Paul Reich into kind of them formulating this plan?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, what's so interesting about our democracy that makes it unique from any other attempt at democracy in the past is this idea that there is not one religious creed, there is not one denomination that holds sway over all of the citizens, right? So a bunch of different denominations came here, spread out into more denominations. I think the mention of someone like John Calvin and Calvinism, there's like that's just one interpretation of scripture, where you have a group of individuals who believe that the resources of the earth and their interpretation of Genesis are for humans to use to our advantage for whatever purposes we wish, and those of us who are most successful, that was preordained by God. And I think someone like Rousas Rushdoony looks at that and his interpretation of like, oh, the success that I have. Well, I mean, Rushdoony was a theologian, right? He's not one of these oil and gas billionaires or something like that. Like someone like, well, I guess what's tricky. So I'm trying to like hone this down. Like, so Paul Weyrich is really interesting because he takes people like Rousas Rushdoony, a theologian, an academic, someone who can take this worldview and make it seem intriguing, make it and legitimize it, couch it in his sort of awareness of the Constitution as a legal document, so that there's like a biblical and a legal foundation for this worldview, which is essentially suggesting that some people are inherently better than other people because that's what God decided. So Paul Weyrich brought people like Rushdoony into the fold, right? And then he also brought in these oil and gas billionaires from Texas, Oklahoma, who had a vested interest in policies that basically catered to their interests, lowering taxes, fewer regulations on their industries. So he found that there was common cause between these plutocrats and I guess what I would characterize as these sort of more regressive theological figures in creating an organization like the Council for National Policy. And then the third component of that is sort of the grassroots activism, people who are actually willing to sort of be the foot soldiers and be the very vocal activists for this worldview. So yeah, I mean, Paul Weyrich facilitated the intermingling of these different entities, and the Council for National Policy is sort of the conduit through which he did that. And to your point about Trump as a symptom, I think as we've established in the film, the organizational network of the Council for National Policy is a dense, wide-sweeping, all-encompassing movement where the Council for National Policy isn't necessarily fulfilling every aspect of its vision, but it has members of its board who head up other organizations who focus on more specialized interests. But that network is very large and very powerful, and I think that's ultimately going to be around for a while. And I think people keep asking us like, oh, what's the left's equivalent to the Council for National Policy? And I don't know, it's difficult. It's a difficult question for me because the Council for National Policy, like some of the work that they do now, they're very actively abusing people's personal information to target them. And I'm kind of thinking well, I don't want that to happen on the other end, but at the same time, so on the one hand, I'm like, wait, we don't want to replicate this. But I guess at the same time, I guess it's sort of this question of well, how are you actively competing effectively with them if they're this very vocal minority who's having such a big impact? How the heck are you going to keep up with them? And I'm not a political strategist at all. I'm just a filmmaker, so I don't know how to address that. But I think the moral core of our film is rooted in Reverend Barber's interpretation of scripture, and I guess his movement through the Poor People's Campaign. We don't really get into that in the film, but he's basically talking about how legislation is inherently a moral document, is an extension of our values. It's an extension of what we feel we should prioritize as a collective culture. And he simply advocates for policy that lifts up low income individuals, lifts up the poor, the vast majority of whom happen to be white. And I guess so you have this intersection of historical racism with this idea that you do have a lot of people who feel that their voices aren't being heard, maybe because they're from a rural southern state, they're in Mississippi or something, they don't feel that their voice is represented. So they kind of fall in line with these sort of conservative entities that have always kind of preyed on them, where I think Reverend Barber is sort of suggesting oh, well, we should approach them, offer them an alternative, show them that we care about them and want to hear their voices. And, maybe that'll make a difference, because that's a very large untapped constituency of folks who aren't voting. There are just as many people who aren't voting who are poor and working class as there are evangelicals in the country. It's almost 40 million people. So I'm thinking there's probably more than that, but so maybe he has a point there. But yeah, yeah, I think I lost track of the initial question about Weyrich and Rushdoony, but But yeah, anyways.
Yes. No,
Feel free to cut me off anytime.
What's interesting also, you talked about the dynamiting for the tactics. What I wanted to know is, not every mega church is the same, which I think should be a very important distinction. What I wanted to know is, how do they go about finding that mega church that will speak their message? Because there is the church, you could argue the church of Trump, the church of Republicans, that go directly after their congregation. But how do they find out which churches to target?
Well, what's interesting about Glue, that's the organization that provides these data sets. This we all learned through our investigative journalist Brent Allpress. He provided a lot of this data. He's a close collaborator with Ann Nelson, who's also featured throughout the film, the author of Shadow Network. And basically, kind of like the Koch brothers funded I360, these data collection entities, they're not, Glue itself isn't targeting churches. Like, I think they collect data. That's their business. That's what they do. And anyone can come to them and pay to get access to that data. So I think it has to do, I think, largely with the administration of the churches who are actively seeking out and paying for access to that data and how they intend to use it. So I think it's more, I'm not sure what it looks like on an interpersonal level, say, between, pastors and the members of the Council for National Policy. But I mean, yeah, honestly, like the resources that Glue makes available could be just as readily available to anyone who wants to pay to have that access. Because I mean, there are people in our film, like I know Lisa Sharon Harper was talking about, like, oh, like I spoke on a panel with Glue. I didn't realize that their tactics, I didn't realize they were using people's self-disclosed like mental health data and stuff. That seems a little skeevy. Like, I had no idea. I think so. I'm not totally sure what the relationship between the administration of the churches or the pastors who are actually seeking out that information with entities like the Council for National Policy. I'm not entirely sure what that looks like. But I think you have a lot of pastors, whether they're at the megachurch level or smaller community churches. Like even our guy Ken Peters, the guy at Patriot Church, who we kind of focus on as sort of an example of Christian nationalist oriented ministry. He just goes to a lot of these America First rallies, and he ended up becoming friends with Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, who ended up flying him to the January 5th event before the very famous January 6th insurrection. So like you just have all these people, you have these political figures who know that they can tap into these religious communities who are very intentionally intermingling with them to kind of bring them into the fold. I mean, Mike Lindell, his whole thing, he's all about what was the voting machine?
Dominion.
Dominion. He's big into the Dominion related conspiratorial stuff. But he has money, and then this pastor, he's like willing to fly this pastor to DC. He's like, oh yeah, well maybe I believe this too. I'm gonna go talk to my church about it. So they do have like a very weird sort of like grassroots approach in terms of how they intermingle with regular pastors. I can't speak to someone like, Joel Osteen or Kenneth Copeland or those like very famous mega churches, because I mean, I don't think they do a ton of, well, I don't think someone like Joel Osteen necessarily does a lot of like really explicit politicking from the pulpit, but Kenneth Copeland definitely does. But um, but yeah, I don't have a great handle on what the communication between like the Council for National Policy and those ministers looks like, I think is the short answer.
Right. What was also very interesting was you touched upon, this is, it's supposed to be a white Christian society is what they really want, especially white male as well, full nucleus family. But what's interesting is they also use and recruit people of color within their organizations. Can you talk about the importance of that inclusion, even though you could argue they're working for their own downfall?
Sure. I mean, I think a popular example of that, like Mark Robinson is the leading gubernatorial candidate in North Carolina right now. And who's like a lot of his, sermons are driven by explicit hate speech. But he also happens to be a fiscal conservative, which is in alignment with the, I guess, economic goals of a group like the Council for National Policy. I mean, they want to appear as if they're as inclusive as possible, right? Like the idea that like the woke leftist culture, like, oh, they're catering too much to these like tiny minorities, like, oh, but yeah, but we care about everybody too. So see, we have a black pastor, we have a Latino pastor in our midst. But I don't know. I look at footage like there's a footage from there's a footage in the film from 2017. Trump signed this Day of Prayer pronouncement, which is like whatever. Like every president does that. That's not a problem. Day of Prayer is great. I have no qualms with that. It depends on how you interpret prayer. But the fact that the only people represented behind him were just these very conservative evangelical ministers, most of whom were white. There's a couple people in there filling in the gaps. So it's like, oh, okay, you can't say that it's all white men because, oh, there's one woman and there's one black guy and there's one Latino guy or something like that. But yeah, I mean, they try to present themselves as if they are a unified, multiracial, multicultural coalition. But I think that's a complete farce. If you look at the data from like Robbie Jones at PRRI, or you look at Pew, just statistically, I don't think like the constituency that backs Trump reflects what they're sort of projecting or trying to project. I mean, that being said, I know that there are some minority groups who are kind of favoring Trump a little bit more than Biden more recently, for various reasons. So I know, because I know, like in Florida, for example, a lot of like Cuban emigres and stuff, who have this historical generational baggage of the Castro regime, and they're like, oh, like communism, socialism is communism, and Joe Biden is apparently a communist, so like I don't want anything to do with that. So whatever, Trump is fine. Like I'm like, so I get it. Like I think MAGA's really good at taking people's legitimate grievances and sort of disorienting them and sort of misdirecting what the source of those grievances are. Actually, I think to your point before about getting people to vote against their own interests, it's quite a dance. I mean, it's like it goes back to like the Southern strategy with Nixon, like in the 60s and early 70s. It's sort of this sort of I think he called it positive polarization was the term, where you find ways to create divisions within a community or to attach blame with a particular entity, whether it's, the war on drugs, or whether it's more explicit racism in the previous generation of politics. Just MAGA's really good at finding those things that divide people. And but yeah. And I think, some people are just disenchanted with, they don't see the impacts, I guess, the positive influence of, say, the Biden administration on their lives. So I think it's a lot easier to approach them with a populist candidate and be like, aren't you tired of the same old stuff? Like, gas prices are crazy, and eggs are expensive and whatever. Like, maybe we need a different approach, even though we already went with the different approach a few years ago. People's memories are pretty short when it comes to this type of stuff. So I think it's helpful. Hopefully our film can orient people to this long history of manipulation, to kind of refresh their memory of maybe why Trump's presidency wasn't so successful, and maybe why he is in fact kind of antithetical to our values as a democratic republic. But yeah.
What's interesting, you very much focus on January 6th, but there's a much larger picture of the 7 pillars. And January 6th was just one of the things that happened as a result of these 7 pillars, which are family, religion, entertainment, media, education, business, and government. That's how they are to convince people and to take down these pillars and to replace them with their own people. Can you talk about the importance of bringing to light the 7 pillars and how that will look in the future?
Yeah. 7 mountains dominionism. I think this is an ideology or an approach to interpretation of scripture that's been around for quite a while. But I think there are figures, like, we focus on Lance Wallnau in the film. He's sort of a dominionist, self-described prophet. Again, it provides a very simple framework for this movement to proceed at implementing their vision of an allegedly Christian nation. It lays it out in a very simple structure. Like, okay, here are all the elements. And I think a group like the Council for National Policy has been really good at connecting sort of the doers and the donors, to quote their former president. I guess who can each then specialize in each of these pillars. Like Morton Blackwell was one of the early sort of co-founders of the Council for National Policy. He started a group called the Leadership Institute, which trains political hopefuls sort of in alignment with their values. They've had thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of students pass through the Leadership Institute over the last 3 decades since it was founded. Popular, or some famous alums, was it Dan Crenshaw, I think Ted Cruz, like, Mike Pence speaks to the group frequently, Mitch McConnell. So like a whole grab bag of these sort of conservative figures. I hesitate to say luminaries. But yeah, the Council for National Policy, that's just one entity. So like, okay, we're gonna go after government. We got to start with young people. Let's have our own like political action coalition. I mean, they have like a dozen of entities similar to this. So when you have a framework like this, you have a blueprint, you have the financial backing of oil and gas interests, who would benefit from, a more conservative administration, you kind of have a recipe for machinery that's gonna last for quite a while. Yeah, I mean, in the film, we don't go into each of the 7 pillars and the because it would take quite a while. But yeah, I think it's this apparatus. I don't know if how long it had existed before it's been used in a political context. Um, but kind of like how we use Weirich's manifesto sort of to set up, okay, like this is very intentional, this is very methodically planned out. I think the seven mountains dominionism sort of it at least appears to be rooted in religious doctrine, which is, I think, kind of appeals to people's values as Christians. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's a tool for political mobilization. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answered the question, but
yes. Lastly, Project 2025. Sorry.
Yes.
That was very 1,000-page document, basically about control of the government and how they plan to implement. And we've seen this coming from 2016, slowly with the rollbacks, especially when it came to the Supreme Court, Roe versus Wade. We do have now their protests. They're trying to ban protesting in 3 states, which is Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi. They're currently hearing a case about homelessness and whether or not it's illegal to sleep on the streets. Can you talk about some of the important parts of the project, and is there a way to putting a stop to this?
Well, the Heritage Foundation, who penned Project 2025, is another project of Paul Weirich. Paul Weirich, in addition to the Council for National Policy, also founded the American Legislative Exchange Council. He was also a co-founder of the Federalist Society, who was responsible for a lot of the judicial appointments during the Trump administration. And he also founded the Heritage Foundation. So I think he's sort of the connective tissue that that sort of unifies this vision that has only grown in strength over the past few decades. I mean, Project 2025, there isn't a lot of what I would characterize as explicit Christian nationalist language in the document, but ultimately it seeks to give the executive branch much more power than it currently has, and it kind of throws off the balance, the separation of powers that's enshrined in our Constitution. So I think it's this idea that, okay, if we can get Trump, who's our blunt instrument, back into office, how can we undermine the powers of the judiciary and mainly the executive, the legislative branch, to give him disproportionate power so that he can function more like an autocrat? And I think that's kind of the primary goal. Because they're like, okay, even if he's only in for 4 years, like, what's the way for him to do the maximum amount of damage? I mean, ultimately, the Heritage Foundation, the Council for National Policy, over the course of Trump's presidency, those guys were in the White House all the time. They had set weekly meetings in the White House. Like, he fulfilled a lot of their vision that they laid out before he came into office. So I feel like that's only going to get amplified. Like, it's not like he's bringing in a new cast of advisors and characters. It's going to be the same people, if not more of these wackos, like more outside on the fringe. So I think if he's elected, I think every effort to implement the vision of Project 2025 is going to be carried out. So I think ultimately it's a matter of mobilizing people to help understand that this isn't an election. Like, we have to rise above the sort of bipartisan discord, and we have to acknowledge that that Trump is not an authentic representation of what the Republican Party has represented historically. I'm talking about, let's go back to Lincoln. We were at a conference with called the Summit for Religious Freedom in DC last week, and Jamie Raskin was like, "I'd like to quote the last great Republican president, Abraham Lincoln." Everybody laughed or whatever, but yeah, it's sort of this is a very consequential moment, and I think there's a lot of younger people in particular who are striving for pretty significant change in how our government functions, and the means of the feedback loop between constituents and legislators, and accountability. But I feel like it's going to be not all of that's going to happen in the next 6 months, right? So I think it's sort of, I think we have to acknowledge there are two very different visions about what our country is and what it can be and what it has been. So I think, do we want to be a nation that's about building community, coming together, trying to reshape things for the better, or do we want to fixate on this distortion of the past and talk about separation, and with all this very xenophobic language? And I don't know, it's like we tried to make a nuanced film that wasn't black and white, because that's what the vision of the Council for National Policy is. They're like, this is clearly good, this is clearly evil, no discussion. So it's hard for me to say at the end of all of this, like, ultimately, like, we have to elect one candidate over another. We have to elect Joe Biden, but I don't, based on where things are, like, he's the only candidate between the two of them that actually wants to grow and develop sort of our nation into something that represents all of us, rather than dividing us. So kind of lame, but that's that's where we're at. That's where we're at, Dan.
I understand. Thank you so much for speaking to me. This was a fascinating, in-depth documentary, that so much information, and you could say life-changing. So thank you so much.